Hello and welcome to our second cash flow forecasting web chat on how to solve three vital challenges in cash flow forecasting. We are joined by CEO and co-founder of Cashforce, who've been in business for 6 years, providing innovative solutions to cash flow forecasting. Previously, Nicolas was with PwC. The first question we need to answer is, why is cash flow forecasting essential?
Thank you, Jack. First of all, to start, there are many motives why corporates, small, mid-sized and large corporates, they do cash flow forecasting. But it's one of the most essential questions to first ask. Why are we actually making a cash flow forecast? We see a lot of the treasurers making a cash flow forecast, or basically assistant treasurers making them for the group treasurer, but not always knowing what is the driver behind that. Would it be looking for more cash to support acquisition strategy, to kind of balance the different cash accounts, or to look for just the optimization of your financing strategy? So all different motives to make a cash forecast accurate.
What have you found as the most important one, though? What's the one that comes up most frequently?
I think in the last couple of years, people have been trying to focus more and more on running the business in a kind of cash lean way. So really optimizing working capital and trying to free up more cash flow, if you will. And for that reason, cash flow forecasting has been one of the drivers. Just getting more transparency, more insight in that is one of the drivers behind, let's say, just getting working capital reduced.
Cash flow forecasting is a huge topic. We're going to look at the first major challenge, which is understanding your cash flow drivers. What's going on here, Nicolas?
Well, I think it's very interesting to see when talking to a lot of the corporates out there that we get to, they're so excited about cash flow forecasting and making that better that you tend sometimes to forget that understanding what actually happens and happens, that's basically one of the first things you'll need to do. And I think there is still a catch up to do for a lot of corporates, really understanding what is driving the cash flows within the company and what we call eating and feeding your cash.
How do these vary by company? Because companies and businesses are very different.
And absolutely, Jack. And this is the reason why we try to paint a picture per industry and sometimes even specifically for a specific company on how the cash comes in and goes out. And I think on the slide is a perfect example of if you're a production, let's say manufacturing company, you do have production sites, you have sales offices, you have a group, you have a parent company, a holding company, and the different types of cash flows, they differ so much per different entity that it's only when understanding what is basically eating and feeding the cash per individual type of entity that you really try to understand, or you get to understand the cash flow forecasting mechanics behind that. And I think you mentioned company as a company or industry, but I think also business model is another, I would say, factor that defines what is eating and feeding your cash flows.
I seem to remember that there are some basic business models that are so fundamentally different. You've constructed models this is the starting point for a particular company. How do you do this?
Well, we did this indeed for, we have manufacturing, telco companies, distribution, wholesale, you have subscription-based businesses. So all of them have different types of cash flows. What we did is we tried to make sure we kind of generalized some of the cash flows that we saw. Some of the concepts that are used in corporate treasury, we try to conceptualize them, and we try to put them in what we call 10 kind of cash flow models, cash flow templates, if you like. And I think this is first used to understand the actual cash flows, what happens currently, and then to make the next step to cash flow forecasting.
So what is the second challenge? The second challenge is how to make accurate forecasts. But what is accuracy?
No, it's a good question. What is accuracy? And again, it really varies per different industry, per different business model. Some companies, well, they will look and strive for 97% of accuracy in 1 week, and they'll go down to about 90 in about 3 or 4 weeks' time. There are businesses that are already lucky when they achieve accuracy up to 80% after a couple of weeks. So it really varies per type of environment.
And then there's a link between the right data and the right logic. What do you mean here?
I think how to make an accurate forecast, it's an obvious challenge. And for us, the secret is a bit linking the right data, that is defining what the cash flow will be like, with the right logic. And when you take like a quick example here, on top you have the data sources behind the cash inflows. You have data for short-term, data for mid-term and long-term forecasting. In the short term, it's in your ERP system, your SAP, your Oracle system, defining the invoices that are booked in the system and with due dates tied up to it. But the problem is when you look further down the road, you need orders on the books, you need sales forecast to be anywhere near the right sales forecast, the right cash forecast. But then you go to a next step because you know that customers, they won't pay on time. So just building a cash flow forecast on due date, that will tell you something, but typically that won't happen. So you won't be accurate. And that's why if you look a bit below on the row with payment behavior, you'll see that we will apply real payment behavior. We'll calculate that. And there, I think a little important point to note is that we'll see a lot of treasurers that apply like a DSO to, let's say, define a better moment where a customer or customer group will pay. But we see that DSO basically takes into account a lot of month-end effects and can be calculated in so many different ways. What we tend to look at is what we call the weighted average payment days, the moment on which we think a customer really will pay based on how he's structurally paid. And that's what we call logic that we applied. And it's just a simple one, but it can go as far as basically looking at order to invoicing lead times and applying that to your order book.
That requires a lot of data, though. Do you do it at an individual transaction level?
It does require a lot of data, and we get the question quite a lot because the current way of doing this for 80% of the treasurers out there is in Excel. Now, you know, just as me, that Excel has its limitations, and when you put a lot of data in it, it will get slow, it won't calculate it enough. Plus, you'll have potential risk of really having errors within the spreadsheets. So, but we think that having transactional data has actually the advantage of always be able to look back what you did, what were the assumptions, and how can you fine tune. So we thought of a process where data would come up to an engine that is capable of having millions of transactions being processed and still being able to apply the smart logics and to combine the data to come to a more accurate forecast.
And that's essentially what Cashforce does, isn't it?
True, absolutely.
Right, now moving on, the third challenge is, it seems obvious to involve the right people in the right process in cash flow forecasting. But how do corporates do this badly? What are the sins involved here?
I think indeed, Jack, it sounds simple, and I think it's, let's say, any consulting approach would basically say you need to have the right people at the right time in the right process. Absolutely right. Let me give you just a quick example of what we've seen a lot in the last couple of months and years, is that when you have a corporate treasury sitting centrally and getting forecasts from all around the world, coming in at different times and really getting, let's say, a consolidated view back to the corporate treasury. Now, let's take a step back. What is the goal of sending over all that data and then consolidating that? Well, for the headquarter team, the central treasury team, they want to have a good view on how they can fund the business, but more essentially on how they can more, let's say, better fund the business and be more working capital optimized. While actually, if you look to the local teams, they typically only have the incentive to make sure that they send over the data and it's as accurate as possible. But you can be 100% accurate, but that doesn't say that you're actually cash, let's say cash effective. You are cash optimized. So there is sometimes a misalignment in the goals that the central treasury team will have and the local treasury or the local.
That sounds an interesting political problem. Do you get involved in these discussions?
No, absolutely. I think it's interesting that people spend millions of dollars on just trying to make the process more in sync with their organization and just getting the data all together in centralized systems, whether it be Cashforce or one another. The problem here is more deeply in what are the goals and what are you trying to achieve. We see different times that the local teams, they're really fed up by just sending all the time that little spreadsheet all the way up to the central team. But when they know that they have an incentive as well to optimize the way that they run the business, cash effective, then, and there are basically incentives linked to that, it's a different story. And it's actually the way that we see a more cash optimization, cash optimized organizations running.
So if we bring all this together, what can we do now with these insights?
We just covered a couple, let's say the basic 3 steps or 3 challenges and the way we potentially could solve it. And when you want to move to the next level, you have your first forecast. Question remains on what do you do with it now? Can you now compare that to a simulation? Can you compare that with the actuals? And I think in the screenshot, you'll see a blue line and an orange dotted line. And you can actually follow up and drill down on differences. And let's assume that the orange dotted line is the one where you have actual paying behavior from your customers. And the blue line shows you what the customers or what date that the due date the customers actually should respect. Now from this, you could see in the first little part of our graph that when you look to actual customer payment behavior, you actually should get on the phone and you should try to chase those customers, because otherwise you will have a less cash optimal situation. So that's the next step. That's really when you get all of the data together, when you have your first forecast together, you can run simulations and you can search for opportunities to improve in the business.
It sounds like utopia.
That's it.
Thank you very much. That was most interesting.
Thank you.
This has been about the basics, and our next web chat with Nicolas will be on more advanced techniques and things you can do to optimize your cash flow forecasting.